thank you for coming to tonight's program, marking the 180th anniversary of the Lost Franklin expedition. We are pleased to have Matthew Picklo as tonight's presenter. He was here a few years ago to deliver the program, America's History of Mourning, which detailed the grieving practice of our nation's citizens. Matt earned his bachelor's degree in music and history from the University of Pittsburgh, as well as his master in education from the same institution. For the past 2 years, he has been a history instructor at the Falk Laboratory School, which is affiliated with the University of Pittsburgh. So it's our pleasure to introduce Matt.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming out. Back again with another quite morbid topic. So, like they were saying, I typically teach 6th graders this year. Last year was 7th and 8th grade, so a bit of an age jump between the last 5 days of teaching, coming up here and doing this. But I really got into learning about this very specific instance in maritime history in America over the last year, and I presented it not only to my 6th graders as a special Halloween lesson, but also to my friends and my fiance, who will never stop hearing me talk about this. So thank you all for coming out. So quite an interesting, interest of mine. So the Franklin expedition. Let's begin right before when we are sending people over to America in the first place. Now, the Silk Roads in Asia at the time, and all of the other trade routes across the sea and across the land are pretty much shut down. That's kind of the leading reason why people are coming to America. The Ottoman Empire takes over Constantinople in 1452, shuts down trade along the south. The Black Death hits Europe and Asia a little bit before that, but it destroys the Mongol Empire, which makes the Silk Road travel in the north very unsafe. In order to look for trade routes, Europe is trying to go either around Africa or later ends up finding America. So everyone has these colonial empires coming to America, and they're finding new ways to essentially make the best of the situation. So we see throughout this time period a lot of the logs. This is a really interesting project that someone did, where they took ship logs from the age of colonization, not just for the British, there's all the other ones for like the Dutch, the French, the Spanish. I wanted to focus in on the British. They spent a lot going around the Cape of Africa, and then of course going across the Atlantic to the Americas. But there's one key area where they keep sending ships up north. They're trying to find another way to get through the Americas rather than having to go around Africa, or even worse, around South America and crossing the Pacific. They're still looking for the Northwest Passage, this famed, fabled passage that will be a straight shot through the Americas, so that they can just sail right through the north and land in Asia. So they've been searching for this for a long, long time. We're going to begin 180 years ago in 2 days, May 19th, 1845. We are trying to look still, or the British, I should say, are trying to look for the Northwest Passage, some way to navigate through the Canadian Arctic to come out the other side. British Admiralty is headed by Sir John Barrow at this time, and he's around 82 or 83 years old, if I remember correctly. He's getting up there. He's looking to retire, but he wants to put one more feather in his cap, finding the Northwest Passage. Now, between the beginning, if I go back really quick, all the way from the 1700s, between then and 1845, the Americans, of course, have our revolution. So we can't exploit the British colonies anymore for all of this wealth. We need to find another way to get the trade. So the Northwest Passage is revitalized. We're sending more ships than ever to try to explore this land. And we've had technology advances that allow for more accurate seafaring. So John Barrow's at the head, he's looking to retire. He wants to find the Northwest Passage to put an end to his career. So he needs someone to head this expedition. He's going to first ask William Edward Parry, who's going to politely turn it down because he's just been on too many Arctic expeditions. He just got back from one, he doesn't want to go on another. So he goes to his second choice, James Clark Ross, who also politely declines, saying, I just got married, my wife doesn't want me to go. So we come to our third, fourth, and fifth top choices. The third choice was James Fitzjames. Born in the British colony in Brazil at the time, likely an illegitimate heir. He's trying to prove himself. He joined the British Admiralty at a very young age, I think around 14 years old, and he had been serving for about 15 years. He's around his 30s, and he's third on the list, except the Admiralty thinks he's too young and inexperienced. So they go to their fourth choice, Captain Francis Crozier. He has the experience. He's been on a few Arctic expeditions, including one with James Clark Ross on the right, and he commands a ship called the Terror. Problem with Crozier, he's Irish. The Admiralty wants a British person to be head of the expedition, so they are going to turn away Crozier and land on Sir John Franklin, whom we get the name Franklin Expedition. So the fifth choice, not that he's unqualified, but he's the fifth choice, gets to be the leader of this expedition. He's also had a little bit of Arctic experience. However, his most recent endeavor was a total failure. He gets the nickname, the man who ate his own boots. So I think you can see how that turned out. He loses about half of his crew during that, but he's able to inspire his crew so much so that even throughout all that, they stay loyal to him. So that's that loyalty, that commanding spirit that is allowing him to drive this force forward. So on the 19th of May, 1845, he commands two ships, the Erebus and the Terror. Now, the Erebus is one of the circles of hell, or I think it's the area outside of the circles of hell in Dante's Inferno. So Erebus and Terror are interesting names for ships that are going to be exploring in basically Arctic hellscape. Both of these ships are bomber-class ships. They are meant for warfare. In fact, they are meant for shooting mortars out into forts and things. The Terror, for instance, was built a bit earlier, and it was used in the War of 1812. It was built in 1813, and it was at Fort McHenry, where the Star-Spangled Banner was written, bombarding the fort. So these are heavy ships. They're designed to be heavy, designed to withstand the shock of firing off mortars and withstand incoming artillery. These two ships, however, have now been outfitted with state-of-the-art technology. Both of them have a steam locomotive put on the inside of it that will turn a very small propeller at the very end, so that even if they're sailing against the wind and in these Arctic conditions trying to break up the ice, they will be able to move about 2 to 4 knots per hour. So not very fast still, but the idea is that even if they get stuck, they should be able to propel themselves forward. In theory, decent. In practice, these are giant, heavy ships, which means they move slow. If you really want to break up ice, you need to be moving fast. So they're not going to be super good. Another side effect of these locomotives is that they have a desalination mechanism. Can't speak, it's been a long week, it's the end of the school year. So they have a desalination machine tied up with it so that they can convert the salt water into usable water for the locomotives. In the machines, they use lead pipes. Lead is going to be key for this, and it's going to keep coming back as we move forward. But it's advised that these people do not drink the water that's used in these machines because of those pipes. In theory, they don't do that. We actually have no idea what happens to them. But we can imagine that they probably drank some of that water. Second state-of-the-art technology, diving suits. These are brand new on the scene, and they're going to be mainly utilized for trying to get ice that is lodged in the propeller out. Third, canned food. Prior to this expedition, canned provisions have never been used before. Canning is so new that they still don't even have a can opener. Cans are going to come back. But the idea here is that the canned provisions are going to, in the British's mind, help stave off scurvy, and it's going to be able to be much more compact and keep fresh food for longer. Prior to this, you had things like hardtack, which would get super moldy, and it would get weevils inside of it. You didn't want that. Everything that they had would go bad within a matter of weeks. You need to be able to stock these ships so that they could last years if necessary. So they actually have 8,000 cans per ship, which are supposed to be able to be rationed, supposed to be able to be used for up to 3 years, 5 if you use strict rationing. So that's keep 3 years worth of provisions, but up to 5 with rationing. And then they also have a dagger type camera, but we don't know what happened to it, or any of the slides that were taken if it was used. So despite having a camera, we don't have any evidence that's tied to that. So like I was saying with these cans, the idea was that you'd be able to stave off scurvy for much longer. We used to have, things like lemon juice, lime juice, things that would be used to prevent scurvy, and they do still have some of this, but the British were thinking that if you were able to capture the food and preserve it in these cans, essentially, that it would keep all of those nutrients. In reality, that goes away pretty quickly. So they relied on these cans because they thought that they would be keeping the food completely fresh and full of its nutrients and vitamins that we needed to keep scurvy away. In reality, it wasn't the case. For those unfamiliar with scurvy, you have wonderful symptoms such as irritability, joint pain, fatigue, and severe symptoms like all your teeth falling out. Any previously opened wounds, scars, they're going to open up again. Your gums are going to swell up and bleed. Your legs are going to swell up. You're going to be much more easily bruised, much more easily wounded. So if you even bump up against the table, all of a sudden you're bleeding and you can't heal as efficiently. So not looking good. So scurvy has always been one of the key things that people are trying to prevent, especially on maritime voyages. They think the canning technology is going to fix that. The problem with the canning technology is not only that it doesn't actually keep all those nutrients and vitamins for a long period of time, but that it's also going to be a rush job done by the lowest bidder. The Admiralty wants to save money. They go with the person who's going to pay the least amount of money to get this done. So it's a rush job. They actually give it to the supplier like less than a month before the ships are meant to set out. Sometime in April, they start canning, and they do such a horrible job that most of the cans have one of 3 problems. One, they're improperly sealed, which means all the food inside is going to be rotten before they even reach America. 2, they're going to be improperly cooked, so they're going to be full of botulism. Or 3, they're going to be sealed so poorly that the lead that they use to solder the cans shut is going to seep into the food. So you can say that the expedition is essentially doomed to begin with. So discounting all of this first, they go to Greenland at a British dock, and here they let off 5 passengers who are too sick to continue. It's likely that they have tuberculosis. So they're going to die, but they're the only survivors of this expedition, if you will, because they didn't even make it to the actual expedition. So they reach Greenland in July, and they stay there for a little bit of time before heading into the Canadian Arctic. And this is where our story truly begins. The Franklin expedition is last seen entering Baffin Bay by British whalers. They're out there, they're looking for safe passage in through the ice. The whalers watch the ships go off into the horizon, and they're never seen again. Until, quite literally, 2014 is when we finally found these ships. So recent scholarship. I'm going to talk about that at the end. Now, these ships are provisioned, like I said, for up to 5 years with strict rationing. 3 realistically. So the first year goes by and they don't expect to hear anything. They expect that these ships are going to have to overwinter in the Arctic. They know that they're going to get stuck at some point. They're aptly fitted so that they can survive through the Arctic winter for at least a year. However, a second year goes by and there's no word. So the wife of the leader, Lady Jane Franklin, is going to go to the Admiralty and say, what is your plan if they do not show up? What are you going to do in order to make sure they come home? And they are kind of meager about it. They put out a reward after 3 years to say, hey, we haven't heard from this expedition. Any information we'll pay for, especially if you discover the ships or what happened to the crew, even more if they are still alive. But Jane doesn't think that's enough. The Admiralty isn't actually sending out any ships at this point to try and bring them home. So she's going to use her best friend, maybe not best friend, but one of her most influential friends, the author Charles Dickens. The two of them are going to raise a lot of money and a lot of attention surrounding this expedition so that British sentiment is going to be very much in favor of trying to bring the lost expedition home, trying to figure out what happened to them, and hopefully, if they're still alive, let's get them home and figure out what happened. That's going to come back. So back to our map, they enter Baffin Bay, and this is about the tail end of what we know for sure exactly what happened. Stop 1, Beachy Island. They enter Baffin Bay, and they go around this little island up here, looking for maybe the Northwest Passage would be more easy to get up through the north. However, it's so full of ice that never melts, packed ice, that they end up just taking the whole year to circle around the island, and they dock right over here at the edge in between these two, Devon Island and the one on the left. Now they see some of the telltale signs of an incoming winter. Sundogs, for example, up north, the more you have, the more frequently you see them, the more likely it's going to be that the winter storms are coming in. You expect that your ships are going to be frozen in. So one of the things that they're able to do, you can see down here, these men are working on turning all the sails into a giant tarp that would cover the ship so that you can move around freely on the upper deck, even in the middle of the coldest winter. It's still going to be cold, but you have a little extra space. I mean, you're on a ship full of a whole bunch of men, and you don't want to go outside because it's very, very, very cold. They will also stack up a bunch of snow onto the sides of the ships to insulate it. Now, a good thing about these locomotives that I mentioned previously is that they're able to pump steam throughout the ship to keep it a little bit warmer. So it's not the least uncomfortable position to be in. And they're not afraid of being stuck in the ice because they expected it. They expected to be in the ice, stuck for at least one winter. So this is not a huge frightening thing. However, they face eternal Arctic nights. I actually bumped up the brightness on both of these so that you can see a little bit better on this screen, but long, long, long nights. And they face disease. It is here where they have to bury 3 of their men. We don't know the exact cause of their death still to this day, but in the 80s, someone actually goes and exhumes the graves and does some autopsies on them, and they are remarkably well-preserved bodies. Don't worry, I don't have any of the pictures for you tonight, but you're welcome to go and look that up. They may be remarkably well-preserved, but they still look like mummies. They've decomposed a little bit. And actually, one of the expedition's right after Franklin's, that is in search of Franklin's expedition back in the 1850s. They actually are the first to discover these graves. This is a picture from that. And while they're trying to dig up one of the graves, they actually kind of shove a pickaxe through the coffin itself and damage it. So whenever the archaeologist in the 80s comes around and tries to do some exhuming and some research, they end up being flooded with a whole bunch of water that turns into ice and packs it in so thick that the archaeologist team has to be really careful trying to slowly melt a little bit of the ice at a time to make sure that water doesn't refreeze in another area and that they don't damage the body with heat or with their tools. So it gets increasingly difficult. So these are those three graves. If you actually go there, there's a fourth grave from another expedition that's looking for Franklin's. But these three are the ones from Franklin's expeditions: John Torrington, William Brain, and John Hartnell. Now, like I said, we don't know exactly, not yet. We don't know exactly what caused this, but that archaeologist in the 80s was able to do some research on them and was able to see that they most likely died from some sort of lung disease. We think it's most likely either pneumonia or, like those 5 who were dropped off in Greenland, tuberculosis. However, we can also see some of the telltale signs of those canning provisions: scurvy and lead poisoning. So we think that maybe those weren't necessarily the key players of what killed them, but they were definitely part of the cause for why those diseases were able to kill them at this point. Especially with tuberculosis, it tends to be a long, drawn-out disease. In fact, this is the point where I'm going to say, if you've ever read any of John Green's books, like The Fault in Our Stars, he just published a new book all about tuberculosis called Everything is Tuberculosis. That's my book plug. Highly recommend that you all read it. It's very interesting. But so tuberculosis, for example, would be a much longer disease. These people, if they had showed any signs of tuberculosis within the last year, they would have been dropped off at Greenland, just like the other 5. So for the disease to kill them so quickly, they must have had some sort of outside effect like scurvy or lead poisoning. And a lot of them, because of the industry at the time, likely already had some minor levels of lead poisoning already, or lead in their system. It's here that we get into the speculation. We know that they sailed down these islands and ended at the tip, the very top of what today we know as King William Island. Back then, they didn't know if it was an island or not. And this is going to be key for why the expedition fails so utterly. One theory was that it was an island, and that if they were to go around the eastern side, if it was an island, they could find the Northwest Passage right here. If it is, as they believed, King William Land, then they would spend an entire year going further south and only having to re-winter in here before sailing back up and going around it. So Franklin makes the tough decision and says, I think it's King William Land, and goes to the west. The problem with this decision is that all of the Arctic ice, the pack ice from years and years and years of thaw and freeze, and all this ice that never melts, it's perpetually frozen, is pushed down these channels into this point. He couldn't have made a more disastrous decision at this point. If he was to sail southeast and around and discover that it really was King William Island, he would have found the Northwest Passage. All he would have had to do is go west, and he'd be out the other side. Instead, he went west to begin with and got stuck almost immediately in pack ice. Eventually, more closer to today, researchers have been able to pick up or dig out ice cores that show that this stretch of 50 years at this time was the coldest in recent history in the Canadian Arctic. So they also just happen to be searching at the worst possible time. So they get stuck. Again, they've got 3 years of provisions. They expect that it's not going to be unlikely that they'll have to overwinter again in these conditions. But when the ice doesn't let up for a whole year and they never move, things start to look a little drastic. So let's return to those cans. We can see this is one of those cans. They would have to punch a hole into the top. Like I said, can openers were not invented before they sent out this expedition with cans. But we can see they would solder these shut and solder the top shut as well. So all of this is possible lead soldering to getting into the food itself. Here's some of the preserved meat from the canned provisions on display at a museum. So most of this meat would have been rotten or filled with botulism. And another key thing is that their tools, their silverware, for example, were most likely made of pewter, which is a lead-based alloy. So even with that, the cans, their eating utensils, the pipes in their ship, they're all made with lead. So some of the things that archaeologists and researchers have been able to find over the years are stacks of these cans. So they actually found the cans arranged like this from the Franklin expedition. You can see the soldering on this can. Looks a little messy. There's not much left behind by the Franklin expedition, especially that which the researchers closer to today have been able to find. So this makes it all the more perplexing. So lead poisoning can lead to blindness, hallucinations. It can lead to your gums turning blue, insomnia, loss of appetite, depression, irritability, memory loss, headaches, delirium, comas, pain, nausea, diarrhea, tremors, more pain, delayed reaction times, convulsions, seizures, weakness, and so on and so forth. Now this is from a book which I'm going to recommend later, but you can see some of the lead exposures at the time. People today, we're right around here. It's not impossible that people today have exposure to lead, but the people who were, or I should say the bones of those three graves on Beachy Island that I discussed are all the way up here. More lead than anyone should have. Now, we know that lead poisoning did play some part in the Franklin expedition's loss. You're going mad out there. Endless Arctic nights, horrible food, horrible conditions, constant cold. It's all going to play a key role, but the lead poisoning is going to heighten that. So people, especially like in the 80s, whenever they exhume those bodies and do this research, they do believe that lead poisoning is a key factor. However, more recent scholarship says it may not be as much of a factor as they were playing it in the 80s. They were able to actually find another one of the bodies of a Franklin expedition member well after the incident at Beachy Island and test some of his DNA and figure out that he actually had pretty much the same high levels of lead that the three expedition members who were buried well beforehand had. So it's possible that the provisions and things like these played some sort of role, but not as much of a role as we originally had thought. However, without much extended evidence, it's impossible to say at this point. But suffice to say, people are being driven mad, and they're becoming more susceptible because of lead poisoning to things like scurvy and other diseases, which scurvy also makes them more susceptible to other diseases. It makes you a lot more weak, a lot more tired, makes it a lot more difficult to fight off diseases, to heal from wounds, so it's all going downhill pretty fast. One of the only bits of information we have from the Franklin expedition itself is this letter, twice written on. See, they would carry these pieces of paper with them that have a whole bunch of different languages from possible European colonial empires that basically give them instructions that if you were to find this paper, you have to try and forward it to the British Embassy, who will then take care of it. So first it has in English, whoever finds this paper is requested to forward it to the Secretary of the Admiralty in London with a note of the time and place in which it was found, or if more convenient, to deliver it for that purpose to the British consul at the nearest port. In the top, well, underneath that you have in type a whole bunch of other languages, the same working. In the top you have a very brief description of what the crew is doing. You have longitude and latitude, so coordinates. And so the first bit, actually let me see, I'll circle it actually. I got this handy dandy tool. Okay. So this part, this upper part, amongst it says that it was written on the 28th of May, 1847. They wintered over the winter of 46 to 47 at Beechey Island. Sir John Franklin commanding the expedition, all is well. So at that point, they were just saying that they had wintered at Beechey Island. That's whenever they buried those three, and then they went down. At this point, the ships have been stuck in ice. They are right off the coast of King William Island, and the cairn, which I'll point out on another map, is at something called Victory Point. This is where, if I remember correctly, James Clark Ross had been previously on another expedition. So this cairn was already there. They stacked up a bunch of rocks with a little metal cylinder inside, and inside that is this piece of paper. So that whoever's traveling there would see this cairn and go and check it out and see if there's anything in it. Especially if, for instance, your expedition randomly disappears off the face of the earth and you're looking for clues. So the next year passes and they have never been able to move. They're still stuck in ice. Within weeks of that first note being written, Sir John Franklin dies. We don't know why, we don't know how. They say that a few days earlier, HMS Terror and Erebus were deserted. Sir John Franklin died 11th of June, 1847. They start tomorrow on the 26th for something called Back's Fish River. This is also often referred to as Back River or Back's River or Backfish River. No one seems to have a clear consensus. But this part is written on the same document along the outside edge, on the margins. And this is written by Captain James Fitzjames. So Crozier, at this time, is in command of the expedition. He is the second in command. James Fitzjames was the third. Crozier has been leading from the Terror, Fitzjames aboard the Erebus. However, their ships are not moving. They're not going to move, and they're running out of provisions fast. So they board up these lifeboats called sledges, and they pull them alongside to try and reach a river that is over 100 miles away. And from that point, it is almost 800 miles to the nearest human settlement, a trading post on the Hudson Bay. Their hope, the reason they need these sledges is not just to pull their provisions along, but when they reach that river, they need a way to get down it. So they have to pull these boats, or else they will never make it. But in order to pull these boats, they are over, I think the estimate was around 8,000 pounds. So you would have small groups of men pulling these 1,000-pound sledges full of supplies, who are dropping dead or dropping delirious, injured, mad from lead poisoning, scurvy, tuberculosis, amongst other diseases, which means one less person pulling the sledge, one more person's weight on top. They have to abandon ship for any hope of survival. This is a contemporary painting of what people believe would have happened. People are dying, they're freezing to death, they're dying from diseases, they're dying from lack of nutrients and vitamins, lack of food, lack of clean water. One of the things is that they also can't hunt for food very effectively, because even if they were to find something like a local seal, it has been evolved over the years to have a certain resistant form of botulism in it. So even if they kill that seal, it is like 9 times out of 10 still going to kill them with disease. So even if they do find fresh game, it's not safe to eat it. And it's so barren up there that almost no one lives up there. A few local Inuit tribes who are going to be key players in a minute. Along the way, they make up small camps. You can see some of the deserted elements here, but they never stay in one place for too long. They leave very little behind, and what they do leave behind is quite perplexing. See, you would think that they would take everything they need to survive with them, but what they end up taking, more than anything else, are things they don't actually need. Silverware, wealthy things like gold and jewelry and pictures, books. They do take things like guns and provisions and things they need to survive, but it's heavily offset by just random items that no one can really seem to discern why they would have thought this was absolutely necessary to pull along on this heavy sledge, which leads more people to believe that the lead poisoning itself was already affecting them. It was affecting their decision making. So, we get into the speculation part. They leave the ships up here at point 1, top of the paint line, and Victory Point, where that stone cairn is right here. So they leave that note there, they fill in the margins, James Fitzjames signs off that says they're heading all the way down, if they can make it, to Backfish River down here. Which means they have to trek somehow across all of this in the dead of the Canadian winter. So, from here, we have a few ideas of what happens to the crew. They're trying to reach Backfish River. Right along here is something that we call Starvation Cove. I think you can probably understand where the name comes from. It's believed that they would have traversed off of the island down south and tried to split up into different groups. We don't know exactly how it happened, but we see some remains and partial remains along both of these stretches, which means that somehow, actually, they may have realized that they just discovered the Northwest Passage. But no one will ever know. No one will actually ever know that they were the first to actually discover it, because they're all dead. It looks like at one point, the group split off and started going back to the ships. There are some Inuit accounts that say that they discovered the ships with a fire still going on one of the stoves and a bunch of men still in their cots, dead. Most likely frozen to death or starved to death. At this time, people were also trying to go back up to the ships. It is believed that they were trying to get back so that they could possibly keep sailing them down. Perhaps the ice started to break up at this time, and they thought they could make another ditch effort to reach the ships and try to keep sailing it onward for help. Most of these people did not make it. One of these is going to be discovered by a later expedition right here, McClintock, which I'll talk about in a minute, and he names it the Boat Place, because he finds a boat there. Very good naming. What ends up happening is that the Erebus and the Terror are abandoned up here, but in 2014 and 2016, they are found here and here, the Erebus and the Terror. So they did end up moving south. What's not clear is if they were piloted there, or if the ice and the shifting waters ended up pushing them there. Regardless, no one made it out alive. We don't know what happened to the vast majority of the crew, but most Inuit accounts say something along the lines of, they all perished over time. Some are reported seeing certain members of the expedition as late as the 1850s, 1856, give or take. Some even identified Captain Crozier based on a photograph that I showed you earlier, saying that he was still around and trying to lead his men as late as 1856. He would have been at that time in his 60s if he actually was alive. So, when Lady Franklin and her friend Charles Dickens are able to rise enough sentiment to get the British to go and search for these people, what they end up finding are bones and Inuit stories, ghosts of the Franklin expedition. No real evidence of what happened to them. They find the bodies, the graves at Beechey Island. They find a few scattered remains here and there, but by and large, no living people. They can't find the boats. The Inuit tell the Europeans, both Americans, Europeans of various sorts like the British, but there's even like French and Spanish getting involved in this search as well. But they all tell pretty much the same thing. They dwindle in numbers as they move further south, and they start eating each other. They have to resort to cannibalism to survive. However, the British public refuses to ever believe that this is a thing. They say that the local Inuit people are all savages, that they cannot possibly understand that Europeans would never, ever do this. Charles Dickens writes, there is, quote, there is no reason whatever to believe that any of its members, the Franklin expedition, prolonged their existence by the dreadful expedient of eating the bodies of their dead companions. They absolutely refuse to believe. And Charles Dickens in particular goes on to write multiple stories that are completely against Native Americans. However, we have found some of those bodies today. And on those bodies are precise cut marks that could only be done by man-made tools. Things like knives. See, we do know that they did resort to cannibalism, not just from the massive amounts of stories all saying the same thing, but because of archaeological evidence, precise cuts along the bones where it would show where they butchered people to pull off their flesh and cook it and eat it. Broken bones where they tried to get at the marrow inside for just a little bit more nutrients, just to survive a little bit longer. So like I was saying, they do discover the terror in, ironically enough, Terror Bay. After the Franklin expedition goes missing, they rename two of the little areas, Erebus Bay and Terror Bay. And it just so happens that terror was there the whole time. Erebus made it all the way down here, but each of these little red dots, I don't know if people can really see that very well. You can find this map on Wikipedia. But each of these red dots is where people have been found there, or I should say remains. They found the Erebus in 2014 and the Terror in 2016. And they were going to do some more research on it in 2020, but I think we all remember what happened that year, huh? So not a lot of research has been done since then. But I want to talk about McClintock's boat place that I mentioned a little bit earlier. A captain in 1859, McClintock, he leads an expedition, and he is able to find some remains of the Franklin expedition. The boat place, I'm going to move ahead really quick just to show you this map. The boat place is right down here. So they would have deserted the Erebus and the Terror up here, gone to Victory Point to drop off that paper, and this group likely would have been, they would have gone all the way down here. It's possible that they went up back to this position based on the orientation of the boat that was discovered. But McClintock finds an interesting scene there. There is one mangled skeleton, so likely cannibalized, and one other skeleton that is more aptly clothed, much more warmly clothed. They have 2 double-barrel shotguns in each hand, 5 gold watches, 11 silver forks, 11 silver spoons, 4 silver teaspoons, a bunch of wool canvas clothing, powder, shot, and charges, brushes, combs, knives, 8 pairs of boots, silk handkerchiefs, 5 Bibles, and 1 novel, handwork slippers, soap towels, 2 rolls of sheet lead, saws, files, nails, and twine, and 40 pounds of chocolate. Most of that stuff, you could argue, you don't need to survive. So again, it's these things that the searchers find that make them think maybe this lead poisoning has driven them to some madness. Because why would someone need 4 guns and 40 pounds of chocolate and 6 different books and 8 pairs of boots when there's only one of you alive here? So some researchers in the 90s start exhuming some of the skeletal remains there. They find this particular jawbone. And on it, I don't know if you can see very well right here, is a little nick. A little bit where someone carved into the jawbone. Again, signs, of cannibalism. That jawbone was none other than the jawbone of Captain James Fitzjames. Through DNA testing, they were able to find a common ancestor with someone living today just last summer. And to determine, based on that common ancestor, the only person who it could have been was James Fitzjames, which is quite intriguing because that means that the cannibalism was not just done among the lower men, but it was partaken of regardless of status. He was the 3rd in command of this expedition, commander of his own ship. So it stretched even to him. So he was most likely that mangled corpse at the end of the boat. And again, this boat was likely returning to the Erebus in the Terror based on the direction that it was heading. So it's at this point that I'm going to give some recommendations. If this has been very interesting to you, there is a great book that is fictionalized that tells the story of what happens called The Terror. And there's a show from AMC of the same name based on that book. Now again, it's fictionalized, but it's pretty accurate, especially the show. It gets down, like it's so accurate that it gets down to the nitpicky stuff, like they use a can opener in their show, which again, they didn't have can openers. But everything else is like very accurate, aside from a supernatural bear that's trying to track them down. But I highly recommend it. It is great. It's got a lot of great actors in it. I have watched it 3 times since last year when I watched it the first time, and that's what got me into all this. So if you like this stuff, watch the show. It's great. It's on Netflix, but I think there's other places you can watch it as well. And finally, 3 books that I've been reading. Frozen in Time, where I get the name of my presentation, focuses on that researcher in the 80s, Owen Beatty was his name, who goes to Beachy Island and brings up those bodies and does the autopsy on them, trying to figure out what happened to them, as well as talking a little bit about what we think happened to the expedition. Ice Ghost, which I'm reading at the moment, focuses on the multiple expeditions after the Franklin expedition that are trying to bring them home or figure out what happened to them. And lastly, May We Be Spared to Meet on Earth, the letters of the Franklin expedition that they send home when they are docked in Greenland just before they enter into Baffin Bay, which gives a personal account of what they expected, what they were feeling at the time, and what could possibly happen next. I'm used to having a touch screen. All right, and that's the end. To this day, we still don't know entirely what happened, but as we move away from the COVID-19 pandemic, we're able to devote some more time and resources towards doing some underwater archaeology on these ships. So I'm sure we will see some more stuff in the years to come. So, thank you for coming.
Matthew will entertain some questions if anybody has any.
Sure. Yes.
So the Inuit peoples that ran across people from the expedition,
Yes.
were they so isolated that they couldn't help them? I mean, you know, they didn't traverse and have communication with settlements or anything like that?
Yes, so this is actually a multi-part answer. So first, yes, they were so sparsely populated and so far away from other like European or American settlements that there was never going to be able to be in communication to people who could help them in time. But second amongst these is that, like I was saying earlier with that ice core sample, this was some of the 50 coldest years in the Canadian Arctic in recent history, which impacted the local hunting, if you will. The local Inuit people were able to develop alongside with those seals that had the botulism, for example. So whenever they were able to hunt the seals, they were able to eat that. But there were less seals that year because of the cold as well. So they were also struggling to get along themselves. And what we see actually is that there are a few Inuit accounts that say that they did try and help the Franklin expedition members that they came across, but they didn't have enough food to spare for all of them and for their own communities at the same time. So almost all of these accounts do mention that they tried to help the Franklin expedition, but they didn't have enough to help both them and themselves. So that also leads to a lot of anti-native settlement amongst the British, sentiment amongst the British, because they are so against thinking that the native people also need to survive. In this instance, they should have given all of their food to the Franklin expedition. Yeah, good question. Any other questions? Yes?
In that one picture that showed where they were taking these heavy, small boats,
Yes.
did I not see dogs?
So, on board the ship, this is a fun fact, there was one cat, one dog, and one monkey named Jacko, which was a gift to Sir John Franklin from his wife just before they depart. I'd have to go back and look at that one specific picture. It wasn't uncommon for, let me see. Yeah, I do see actually a couple dogs in the bottom, perhaps, right down here. Is that what you're mentioning? So it's possible that that the one dog could have still been alive. Now, this is an artist's depiction after the fact. They may not have had all of the facts straight, but there was definitely, for sure, one dog owned by Franklin that was on this expedition, but it's likely that they probably would have eaten that dog. Some Inuit accounts actually do mention that dog, that says that they were still with the men as they are dwindling in numbers. So perhaps they resorted to eating each other before the dog. But again, it's impossible to really say for sure.
How many men were aboard the two ships?
So if I remember correctly, there were 139 whenever they departed. They dropped off 5 in Greenland, so they were down to 134. And then, the 3 died on Beechey Island, so they were down to about 131. I might be off by about 10. I think it may have been 121 and not 131, but it was roughly around that range. So a little over 100 men on board both the Erebus and Terror combined.
How did the British people and Charles Dickens get word that they cannibalized each other?
Mostly from the expeditions that are looking for Franklin's lost expedition.
Absolutely.
They come into contact with the Inuit people and they say, hey, have you seen this before? And actually, to go a little bit further with the Inuit accounts, I mentioned that one of them had pointed at a picture of Francis Crozier, the captain in charge after Franklin, and was able to identify him as one of the people who was alive. A lot of the Inuits that they interviewed to kind of fact check and back this up, they actually had some of the things that the Franklin expedition members carried, such as their brass buttons. So they would show them as well, these are some artifacts from this expedition that prove the authenticity of their accounts. And so the British explorers and people searching the rescuers who failed in their rescue would come back with stories and small bits and pieces of the exhibit, of the expedition. Yes?
Was there any account of the crew members ever using that scuba gear?
I don't believe so. The reason is that this would not have been completely necessary to bring along with them on the sledges, and it would have been extremely heavy. And even though they were likely suffering from some sort of poisoning-induced madness, it seems like they did not take that with them. And so everything that was on board the Erebus, including the ship's log, was either left behind or has been lost to time. So we still have not found any other written evidence aside from this And there's actually one small journal, if you will, that we call the Picklo papers, that are full of nonsense, essentially. Again, possibly going for the lead-induced hysteria madness theory. There's some random elusive poetry in there and a lot of stuff that we can't read because it's so horribly written in, which could also be a side effect of the lead and scurvy. But aside from those two things, there's no written evidence that we found yet.
Was there a scene in the series where they used that scuba gear to dislodge the ice from the...
Yes. Yeah, in the first episode, a chunk of ice gets stuck in the propellers of the Erebus, and one of the sailors aboard the Erebus has to get inside that suit and get pulled down into the Arctic. So it can be quite scary. Also because most of them had never even used that suit before. It's brand new technology, so they can hope that it's like our astronauts gear, in that they will go off into space and they won't completely tear open while they're out in the vacuum. So it's probably quite frightening for someone to step into that suit. Yes?
Prior to the expedition, did they ever test that scuba gear to see if it could withstand Arctic temperatures?
It's likely that they would have, but I would say that the people who were on board this expedition may not have had any prior experience. In fact, a lot of the people commanding these two ships in this expedition didn't have prior Arctic experience. For example, Fitzjames was never in the Arctic, to my knowledge. But Crozier was with Sir James Ross. Hold on, let me just fact check this real quick. So many slides. Yes, James Clark Ross. Crozier was with him on expeditions, as well as Franklin had his own expeditions. If you recall, the man who ate his own shoes. So some of them had some Arctic expedition experience, but most of the people on board these ships didn't have any. So to semi-answer your question, it's quite possible that people were not entirely trained on how to use the suit. It was likely tested beforehand, but it's also just impossible to say without any written evidence. That one collection of letters in the book published, May We Be Spared to Meet on Earth, is, if you could argue, amongst the few primary sources we have of this expedition, because these are letters sent before they went missing. But yeah, so essentially those letters, the Victory Point Cairn letter and the Picklo papers are the only written evidence that we have, and it's limited.
Okay, any more questions?
One more over here.
Matthew,
Yes.
you might have said this and I missed it, but were there other expeditions after that or prior to that to try to find the passage?
Yes. If I remember correctly, they don't officially sort of declare that they found a navigable way through the Canadian labyrinth, if you will, until I think the turn of the century, like 1901, 1902. I could be wrong about that. I most likely am. But they do continue looking for the Northwest Passage, and eventually they do find it, but by that point it's kind of obsolete. It's more about just saying, we're the ones who found this thing that killed so many people. And also it's important to note that Franklin was by far not the first to do this either. Lots have gotten stuck up there as well. Here's an actual fun fact that I was just mentioning with my brother and some friends earlier in the back of the room over here. If you know about the Resolute desks, there's one in the White House, the Oval Office, and one that the Queen of England owns. Oh, sorry, Queen's dead. The King of England owns. I'm a little behind the times. Those desks are made out of wood from the HMS Resolute, which was in search of the Franklin expedition and got stuck up in the ice and abandoned as well. So there are many expeditions before and after, well into the late 1800s, early 1900s.
Actually, I just Googled it, and
Yes.
it was Amundsen was the first one that actually sailed it successfully, and it was 1906. So you were
Okay, I was
pretty
really close
yeah.
then. See, a lot of this is the like third time I've gone through this lesson, if you will, and I keep adding things to it, and it's like, okay, what do I remember correctly?
Yeah, that's
I read a whole bunch of stuff, but it's, of course, like I mentioned, it's the end of the school year. My brain has been turned into soup these days. So
It's the word.
yeah,
It's the lead.
it's the letter. So actually, fun fact, and this might scare you and my mom. Right after I did this, and I was joking with my sixth graders that you know, if I start acting weird, I'll be getting lead poisoning. The city of Pittsburgh gave me a letter that was like, your neighborhood might have lead pipes. It was like literally the day after. Now, we have had our house checked, and we don't have lead pipes. There are some in the neighborhood, but not affecting us. But I told my kids about that, and they were like, okay, Mr. Picklo's gonna go insane. So, but I'm okay. I don't have lead poisoning. Yet. Alright.
I like the inclusion of the lead poisoning because I work in electronics, so when I saw the picture of the soldered can, I was like, ugh.
Yeah.
Like, I was just like,
Yeah, again,
That
rush
can't
job,
be
low is
good.
bitter. They were just rushing to get these provisions on board the ship in time for it to leave less than a month later. So, it was due to begin with.
There's like studies I think done of like on like modern violence and the second radical political ideologies. It's like they found like a lot of places that have shootings and these terrible things and have higher concentrations of lead as well.
Exactly.
So it does make a good map.
Yes. Sure.
I just thought of something. There's some kind of a synergy that goes on with certain materials, like tomatoes in canned stuff that could create
Yeah, things that are
unpleasantness.
higher in acid, among those things that were, you know, put into some of these cans, like tomato-based things, which are higher in acidity, they would eat away at those cans, and lead soldering, which would make the food even less appetizing. So, yes. And also to that point with the desalination machines that they had, the salt water going through those lead pipes would corrode those pipes as well. So if they were drinking that water, it had much higher levels of lead seeping into it as well. Yes.
You mentioned the Inuits eating seals and getting botulism.
So they, a lot of the local Inuit tribes had developed alongside the seals and developed an immunity to it over time. Kind of like if we think about, I've just been teaching my kids about the Great Dying and the Columbian Exchange. So Europeans in this example have raised livestock for hundreds of years before they come over to the Americas, where local tribes hadn't been doing this. And because Europeans over time had been raising livestock, they've grown immune to diseases such as smallpox, whereas local people were not. This is kind of an inverse of that, where the native Inuit tribes had developed some immunity to this botulism that was in these seals and things, but it would be especially deadly to Europeans.
And how did the seals get botulism?
That's a good question that I don't have an answer for.
I know like lobsters, like they're if you don't cook them fast enough, like they have a bacteria that just
Yes.
immediately makes the food like sour.
That's often why they're boiled alive and face down first. Yes.
So in the end of the TV series, it kind of alludes that Captain Crozier joined up with like an Inuit tribe and then was kind of never heard of again. So is that purely Hollywood speculation, or is that like a possibility that maybe some of these guys did?
It's absolutely speculation, but it's also possible. Like I had mentioned very briefly earlier, some of the Inuit accounts identify Crozier as one of the last people seen with the crew. In fact, I think it was as late as like 1856. The last possible sighting of the crew included 4 men, one of which likely could have been Crozier. So it's possible that some of them peeled off along the way and joined these local Inuits, Crozier among them. What we do know is that none of them ever reached a European or American audience.
But that would have been a lot more difficult in 1850
Exactly.
than now.
Yes, like I had said at the very beginning, the closest sort of civilization, if you will, was like 800 miles from where the ships were abandoned. In order to do that, they would have to travel way down along the Backsfish River, which some of them may have gotten to, but none of them reached that settlement. Okay.
It would be amazing if they did a DNA study amongst the Inuit tribes to see if there's any. That would be cool.
Maybe that'll happen one day.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and with that, we're a little over time, so thank you again for coming out and learning about this. I love sharing it, so thank you.
Thank you.